I just have, as I said, very, very simply, one goal, which is 4 years as mayor of this city. It's just as simple as that.
Today, veteran Yankees pitcher C.C. Sabathia announced his return to the team. Staten Island lawyer Richard Luthman was arrested on Friday. The indictment against the controversial attorney includes charges of kidnapping, extortion, and scrap metal fraud. Incoming flights may be delayed due to snow and ice this afternoon. Newark and LaGuardia predict an average delay of 3 hours for some flights, while trips to JFK are slowed down by an hour. A new city law will take effect today. It will send alerts to cell phones to help catch drivers involved in hit and runs. There are planned schedule changes on many subway lines this weekend, including a shutdown of 2 and 3 services into Brooklyn. Southbound F trains are temporarily delayed. The weather this weekend is cloudy, with highs of 42 and temperatures dropping to 29 overnight. Rebecca Ward, Columbia Radio News.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Cassiana McClenahan.
And I'm Aaron Leibowitz. Republican lawmakers appear to have the votes they need to pass their $1.5 trillion tax bill. Senators Marco Rubio and Bob Corker pledged their support, and the final version of the plan was released last night.
Although some changes were made to the earlier Senate and House versions, the big corporate tax cut is still there.
Michael Knoll is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I asked him to explain the latest changes to the bill that President Trump is expected to sign next week. What kind of tax plan is President Trump potentially going to be signing? What does it mean for the average American family?
Well, for those who were following, the plan is pretty close to the Senate version of the bill, but it's probably a little more family-friendly than what that bill originally was like. For a lot of Americans, what it's going to mean they're no longer going to be itemizing their deductions. It should be a little simpler. In the short run, it's likely to reduce their tax liabilities for the average American. The long run is less clear because most things in this bill are temporary. They're scheduled to go away in 10 years.
So who are some of the winners in this bill?
Well, the big winners would be corporations, hedge funds, private equity, real estate. Those are some big winners here.
And the losers?
Well, a big question in terms of sort of losers is the effect of the deficit. This is going to add $1.5 trillion to debt over the projections for the increased debt that we would have gotten anyway over the next 10 years because we're running a deficit. So there's certainly an argument to be made that the next generation, my children and their peers, are the ones who are going to take on more debt, and in many ways those are likely to be the biggest losers.
I know there were some Republicans who were concerned regarding the $1 trillion+ that will be added to the debt. How much did that play into ultimately winning over these last few votes, and is that still a major concern for some lawmakers?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, one gets the sense that that didn't play a big role in getting the last few votes, that those concerns were put aside. It seems that the compromises were in terms of pieces of the deal, not reducing the deficit.
Does that concern you regarding the debt?
Yes. It does. It's because our debt has increased significantly. It's projected to continue to increase to rates that we haven't seen since World War II, and that's a burden that gets passed on to the next generation.
I just want to make sure I understand your general feelings about this bill. What's the impact, good or bad? As an expert, what are your feelings?
Well, I think there are good pieces and bad pieces to it. I think some of the good pieces are reducing the rate for corporations. Our tax rate is much higher than those in other countries, and that is discouraging investment in the United States. So there are some good things here, but there are also some bad aspects to these bills. One is the increase in the debt. Another is because it was purely a Republican bill with no Democratic support so far, pieces such as the sharp reduction in the deductibility of the SALT payments, the state and local tax payments, come across as being politically and targeted at Democratic states. And even if one party sort of has enough votes to get things through, it just tastes bad when some of the provisions look like they're targeted at the other party's states.
That was Michael Knoll, professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School.
Between sky-high rents and competition from online retailers, small businesses are struggling in Manhattan, especially south of 96th Street, where a commercial rent tax applies. It requires business owners to pay 3.9% of their rent in tax.
So this month, the New York City Council passed a new bill exempting some retailers from the tax. But how much will that really help small businesses? Juliette Jabkiro reports.
Rent is expensive in New York City. Robin Hirsch knows that better than most. He has been paying rent for his restaurant, the Cornelia Street Cafe, for 40 years. When he opened it in 1977 in Greenwich Village, his rent cost him $450 a month. Now it is over $36,000.
If we were to apply the raise in our rent to the price of a croissant, we would be charging $77 for a croissant.
The croissant price doesn't go up with the rent, but the commercial rent tax does. The problem is the tax was never meant to affect small businesses. So Councilman Daniel Garadnik says it was time to change it.
When I was elected 12 years ago, if you had told me that mom and pop shops downtown would eventually be paying more than $250,000 a year in rent, I would have laughed you out of the room.
But even with the dramatic rise in rent, the tax hasn't changed in almost 2 decades. That's why the new bill will only impose the commercial rent tax on businesses that pay more than $500,000 in rent.
That will deliver relief to nearly 3,000 Manhattan businesses.
Mayor Bill de Blasio also supported the bill and wanted to send a message to small business owners.
To all the small businesses that are struggling, we have your back.
This may sound exciting, but what is the bill really going to change? Andrew Flam, director of the Small Business Development Center at Pace University, says it will be a boost for local stores.
The legislation to amend the commercial rent tax is going to be helpful in terms of making sure that small business owners have greater flexibility and some additional money in their pocket to be able to invest in, projects that may enable them to compete more effectively in the marketplace.
But if you ask Hirsch, the Cornelia Street Cafe owner, he says the bill is only a small, symbolic step.
This little savings is half a month's rent.
For him, the main issue is not the commercial rent tax itself, but the rents. He says he's worried about the future of his cafe and of his neighborhood, because stores are closing all the time.
Poe has closed, Home has closed, and I just saw yesterday as I walked by that the ramen noodle place that opened a year ago maybe on another corner has closed.
And Hirsch says he knows why.
They're closing because of landlord greed.
Hirsch is hoping for a commercial rent stabilization bill. But even if Mayor de Blasio has promised to keep helping small business in Manhattan, stabilization is not on the agenda. The new commercial rent tax bill will be effective next July. Juliette Jabkiro, Columbia Radio News.
A recent report by the city highlights an ongoing problem within the NYPD, the treatment of transgender and gender nonconforming people. Back in 2012, the NYPD adopted guidelines to cut down on profiling and abuse by officers.
But this fall, the New York City Department of Investigation found significant gaps in how those rules have been rolled out. Rebecca Ward has more.
Ask nearly anyone in the transgender and gender nonconforming community, and they'll tell you that interacting with cops is a risk. To be profiled, disbelieved, misgendered, or worse. To end up assaulted or unfairly arrested. And in New York, that hasn't changed in the 5 years since the NYPD said it would fix the problem.
We can't call the police to make complaints. We're targeted all the time.
Lala Zanel works for the Anti-Violence Project, which helped teach police about the new rules back in 2012. Zanel is also a trans woman of color.
Because of those two identities, I don't want to have interactions with the police at all because it's not a good interaction for me or community members, and this report shows it.
Deborah Laloy is a staff attorney with the Bronx Defenders who represents many LGBTQ clients.
Every single trans and gender nonconforming client who I have ever represented during my time at the Bronx Defenders has reported to me stories and experiences that they've had while in NYPD custody that directly and very clearly violate the new patrol guide changes.
Changes like prohibiting the cops from using trans slurs, putting people in custody not according to their identity, or searching them to assign gender. This new Department of Investigation report analyzed how the new guidelines were going. As Inspector General Philip Ure discovered, not too well.
The recommendations addressed directly is that we found clear gaps in NYPD's implementation of some of these revised policies.
His department's report says gaps include a lack of data collection. Getting better data could help the NYPD track their own compliance with the guidelines. But lots of precincts are still using old paperwork, forms that don't even have a box to tick for a transgender person. And some advocates, like Legal Aid Society attorney Aisha Lewis-McCoy, are not sure the cops can track data accurately in the first place. Often, a transgender person won't want to disclose their identity to the police for fear of mistreatment.
It makes for a tainted pool of data, and that's just demographic information. We haven't even gotten to the point of whether certain policies that are supposed to be, used and employed by NYPD regularly, if that's matching up with what experience the person is having as they're going through an arrest. Like, NYPD is not prioritizing this.
When people do have their rights violated by police while being questioned or arrested, they can file with the Civilian Complaint Review Board. But this kind of complaint is likely to go unpunished.
In most cases, it's our client's word against the police officer's word.
What's more, the Department of Investigation report highlights that only a small percentage of the NYPD's 77 precincts have notified their officers of the guideline changes at all.
Only 6 precincts have been trained on this issue.
Laloy ran one of these trainings, speaking to officers of the 52nd Precinct in the Bronx for a few minutes during roll call.
When you see someone as a human being, it's much harder to hurt them. And my clients, I realized, were not seen as human beings by these officers who I was training. 15 to 20 minutes is not enough time to talk about all of these issues and try to change the minds and hearts of these officers.
With better training and accountability measures, though, she thinks there's a chance. Meanwhile, the NYPD has 2 months. That's its deadline to submit a formal reply to the Department of Investigation, letting the public know which changes it plans to make. Rebecca Ward, Columbia Radio News.
There were over 2,500 structural fires in New York City in November alone. Older buildings with poor infrastructure, outdated safety regulations, and cheap owners are getting the worst of it.
The city has been trying to pass updated fire safety laws for years, but none has been approved. Greg Gottfried has more on the hurdles.
Grisel Espinal's family lived on West 144th Street in a 6th-floor walk-up until a fire in mid-November destroyed the apartment complex and left her family without a place to stay.
The whole floors, like from 6th to the 1st floor, everything burned down.
This wasn't even the first fire at the Espinal's old building. This was just the one that did the most damage.
This area is not bad. It's just that building has a bad luck of getting 4 fires already in less than 4 years, you know?
Perhaps it isn't just bad luck. Dolores Spivak, who studies building codes in New York, says that these older buildings are more dangerous as they don't have enough safety precautions. New regulations to fix this have been in the works, but they're still far from being done.
New York City has no existing building code. But what we have is only a paragraph that states the owner must maintain the building in a safe condition. That is so open-ended.
In Espinal's building and others like it, built in the early 20th century, safety measures are not up to snuff. Older buildings do not have the tight guidelines that these newer ones do.
The new building code has mandated sprinklers in residential spaces. So if that building was built today, they'd have to have sprinklers.
It's these types of changes, sprinklers, accessible staircases, and thicker walls to prevent the spread of fires, that the new building code would require. The common consensus is that owners have too much leeway and don't want to pay the money to fix these problems.
There has been a building code in New York City back into the early 1800s.
That's Deputy Commissioner of Enforcement for the New York Buildings Department, Timothy Hogan.
The codes were very, very minor and very thin in the beginning. So the existing building code is meant to try and cover what needs to be done to maintain those buildings and to make them safe for the New Yorkers.
For 3 years, attempts have been made to pass this code. The Department of Buildings, the City Council, the Fire Department, and building owners have had discussions on this topic. Still, nothing has been done. Spivak says that it often takes a disaster to get laws and regulations through. The attack on the World Trade Center in 2001 and the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911, which killed almost 3,000 and 150 New Yorkers respectively, forced building safety changes.
I think if there, unfortunately, is a disaster like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, or if there were a lot of deaths in the Hamilton Heights fire, I think we would have an existing building code a lot sooner than planned. I think it takes a disaster.
Everyone at the Espinal's building survived with minimal injuries. However, next time may not be so lucky. The Department of Buildings is hoping to get the code passed by 2019 or 2020. Greg Gottfried, Columbia Radio News.
Mayor de Blasio has championed an affordable housing plan for years, but it revolves around renters. Housing advocates say that low-income New Yorkers should have a shot at owning their own home. One way to do that is through community land trusts. It's a model that never quite caught on in New York, but as my co-host Aaron Leibowitz finds, that might be changing.
For over 20 years, there's been just one community land trust in New York City. That's Cooper Square CLT on the Lower East Side. It's a nonprofit that controls 400 low-income units, an affordable housing beacon among the highly gentrified East Village. The monthly mortgage for a studio there, $375. Val Orselli manages these apartments. Sitting in his cluttered office on East 4th Street, he says community land trusts offer affordable homes that stay affordable. That means no house flipping to make a big profit and no landlords trying to push you out.
The mission is permanently affordable housing that is tenant controlled. If you want to speculate, this is not the model for you. But if you want to build a family life, a community life, this is the better way to go.
But it hasn't been an easy road for Cooper Square. Before they became a community land trust, they were a group of activists that clashed with the city for decades. Orselli remembers when things got pretty ugly in the 1970s.
The city at one point started stripping the buildings to make them unrentable. So we did things like we took over the city's office across the street, and we also did a cleanup effort. We dumped about a ton of garbage in front of the city office to prevent the workers from going in.
Cooper Square finally became a community land trust in the 1990s. A CLT is a lot like a limited equity co-op with shared ownership, but CLTs are nonprofits where residents sit on the board. Leo Goldberg of the Center for New York City Neighborhoods notes, New York already has thousands of co-op units. He says CLTs follow a similar model, but with some added perks.
What the CLT does do is when a co-op owner, a single-family homeowner decides to sell, it can ensure that the home is just as affordable as it was to that first homeowner. And then that's repeated every time the property is sold. And that's really different from the existing model.
Now in 2017, new CLTs are starting to pop up around the city. There's Interborough, a coalition of 4 housing nonprofits. There's the East Harlem CLT, and there's another group getting started in northern Manhattan. None of them have acquired any land yet, but they have some support from the city, which announced a $1.6 million grant for CLTs. Matthew Dunbar of Habitat for Humanity says he was thrilled to see CLTs mentioned in the latest version of the mayor's housing plan.
The housing plan even calls out Interborough Community Land Trust as one community land trust that will be essential in preserving some of the units that are being invested in neighborhoods like Edgemere, the South and Southeast Queens, Central Brooklyn. So we're really excited to see that creative solutions that the advocacy and the development community, the nonprofit community are bringing to the city are being listened to.
Much of the funding for these projects would need to come from the city, but housing advocates say it's a good investment because the nonprofits do most of the work. Orselli from Cooper Square says it's a model worth fighting for, but he's seen too much over the years to be convinced that the city is really on board.
We're not going to give up the fight. I think we can make a difference. But until there's a real paradigm change in the city towards creating permanently affordable housing, I can't say I'm optimistic. But I'm not giving up.
New York's new CLTs hope to get off the ground by acquiring vacant lots currently owned by the city. Then they hope to raise enough money to sell homes at prices unheard of across the 5 boroughs. Aaron Leibowitz, Columbia Radio News.
Mayor Bill de Blasio is also aiming to help New Yorkers stay in their homes.
His Seniors First plan would create 30,000 senior households by 2026. But as Lisette Arevalo reports, seniors aged 65 and older can't wait that long.
Madeline Innocent has lived her entire life in Frederick Douglass Public Housing on the Upper West Side. She's 61 years old. That means soon she'll be considered a senior. Innocent says she's concerned.
Because there's no affordable housing for anyone, and they seem to not care whether there's no affordable housing for anyone.
The they she's referring to is the New York City Housing Authority, or NYCHA. 1 out of 4 people living in NYCHA housing is 62 years or older. Madeline Innocent says those 80,000 tenants are more vulnerable to neglect because of their advanced stage. And for them, it's not only a problem of finding affordable housing, but also of upkeep.
I don't understand anybody that allows a senior to either live in an apartment where there's bed bugs or the pipes break. They need support. And this is a big issue.
Nora Moran, a senior policy analyst at United Neighborhood Houses of New York, works with seniors like Innocent. She advocates for public policies and funding so older adults can age in place in their own homes.
Sometimes we forget that there are a significant number of older people living in NYCHA development, and that, they sometimes have specific or different needs compared to some of their peers who are also living in NYCHA housing.
Moran says that this happens because sometimes housing issues are not seen through an aging lens. And even though it's not ideal, public housing is one of the few options for seniors, so it's in demand. According to Live On New York, a nonprofit which advocates for seniors, there is a waiting list of 2,000 older adults for public housing in the city. Caitlin Hosey works with Live On. She says seniors often struggle financially to make ends meet.
Doubling up, having to miss meals to make ends meet, having to skip medications. There are so many adverse choices that come with not being able to pay your rent.
And there's another complication. Often, seniors are taken care of by family members, but NYCHA makes it difficult to add them to their lease. Andrea Tan, lawyer at Legal Services New York, has seen this often.
I don't think they're trained or really understand the needs of seniors, that they need to have loved ones to come take care of them, because most of the times those requests are denied.
That's what happened to Eddie. He gave up his apartment to move in with his mother when her dementia started to get bad. I'm not using his last name because he has an open court case.
And she become very violent. She used to get a knife. She chased some of the neighbors in the house with a knife.
Eddie's mother had a home attendant that was willing to live with her, but NYCHA declined the request because the apartment was too small. Eddie asked for a bigger apartment and they said no. So he moved in to take care of his mother without NYCHA's authorization. And 5 years later, in February 2016, his mother passed away. Now NYCHA wants to evict him.
If your parent passes away, get ready for a fight. They're going to try to throw you out.
For legal services lawyer Andrea Tan, this is proof of how NYCHA's neglect affects more than just senior residents.
This policy has a great effect on the children of the senior residents. The risk of eviction the whole time that you're living there unauthorized, if they find out, they could try to evict you, right? So this is not how people should live.
NYCHA didn't respond to our request for comment. As for Eddie, the city has given him until April to move out of the apartment, but he says he will fight it. Lisette Arevalo, Columbia Radio News.
You're listening to Uptown Radio.
There's more to come. Stay with us.
You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Cassiana McClenahan.
And I'm Aaron Leibowitz.
Coming up, we have stories on declining sales of motorcycles and bookstores in the Bronx.
And why indie movies are winning all the awards. But first, Harley-Davidson has hit a rough patch. Last month, the company's sales skidded down 8% from the same time last year. While motorcycles were the definition of cool in the 1960s, the customers Harley is hoping to attract today, millennials, are more excited about the latest iPhone. My co-host Cassiana McClenahan has more about Harley's stalled bikes.
When Peter Fonda rode his custom Harley-Davidson into movie theaters in Easy Rider, this is what cool sounded like.
Get your motor running. Head out on the highway.
Like the movie's heroes, in 1969, bikers were seen as society's mavericks. The next year, motorcycle sales spiked. But lately, Harley's sales efforts have run into some challenges. The biggest reason? Millennials.
Motorcycling is a fairly solitary pursuit. Millennials tend to be more group-minded.
That's Mary Lee Bliss, the chief content officer of Y-Pulse, a youth marketing and research firm. She's seen fall off in all kinds of activities,
including even individual sports.
When millennials aren't on their smartphones, they're spending time outdoors, reading, or exercising. Not only do millennials prefer to work together, after coming of age during the uncertainty of the financial crisis, they're also more cautious.
Millennials are a risk-averse generation. They tend to shy away from very dangerous things or things that they've been told are dangerous, and motorcycles do have that reputation.
And millennials are also saddled with record amounts of student debt. Andrew Collins writes car and motorcycle reviews for Jalopnik.com. He's also a millennial.
In a world where a lot of people are still living with their parents and having trouble finding work, I think it's tough to justify like $15,000 on what is essentially a toy.
Collins is a biker himself, and a lot of his friends used to be too.
There's been a lot of attrition, at least in my friend group. Friends of mine have sold their machines. My dad got rid of his bike, and I'm one of the last people I know that still rides.
As older bikers' bad hips or creaky knees slow down their riding habits, they're putting their motorcycles up for sale. Where today's cars are full of computer chips and technology, for years motorcycles were more conservative.
The technological differences from year to year aren't that dramatic. If you were to drive a 20-year-old car today, it would feel like watching a black and white TV. But a 20-year-old motorcycle might look and feel almost exactly the same as a motorcycle you could buy today. There's just not that much innovation.
This means that used bikes stay on the road longer, trading riders without making a dent in Harley's new bike sales. The used Harley market is now twice the size of new motorcycle sales. Harley is pushing back, revving up production of more innovative bikes.
The company has a plan to launch 100 new motorcycles over the next 10 years. A lot of those motorcycles are geared towards that younger market.
That's Heber Rasmussen. He's at the New York Motorcycle Show, teaching new riders how to handle a bike.
Ready? Okay, so go ahead and pull in the clutch.
Over 50,000 people have completed the course so far this year through Harley's dealer-run motorcycle academies. The company sells about 250,000 bikes worldwide, so it's possible that if these new riders opt for a Harley, they could make an impact to the company's bottom line. But whether millennials will come to feel the call of the open road remains to be seen. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Cassiana McClenahan.
Meanwhile, in the Bronx, there isn't a single bookstore.
But there will be one early next year. That's when Lit Bar, a bookstore and wine bar, will open in Mott Haven.
As the South Bronx slowly develops, Sheila Dang reports on what challenges remain for independent bookstores.
The Bronx is geographically the largest borough in New York City. It's so big, some of its residents don't even realize there isn't a bookstore anywhere in the Bronx. So do you know where the nearest bookstore in the Bronx is?
Unfortunately, no. I might have passed it on the bus.
Larissa Grinchpin lives in Kingsbridge on the west side of the Bronx. I broke the news to her that there hasn't been a bookstore in the Bronx since Barnes & Noble shut down its store here last year.
I think it's a bad situation. But I do think nowadays people can get by without bookstores.
Chain bookstores may be struggling, but others seem to be doing just fine. The Strand, for example, is usually packed with both New Yorkers and tourists. I asked Marcia Flicker, who's a professor at Fordham Business School, what does it take to go the way of the Strand and not Barnes & Noble?
oh, Lord, if I had a magic formula, I'd make $1 million or more.
But Flickr says retailing is now more about selling the experience in the store rather than the actual merchandise. So it makes sense why the Lit Bar will have drinks to get customers to stick around and relax.
It's a social, interactive evening and networking environment, which also involves books, which can be the spur of conversations and the opening to meeting other people.
That social environment is exactly what Word Up Community Bookshop tries to provide for the Washington Heights neighborhood. Word Up opened in 2011 to serve an area that didn't have other bookstores, and it's almost entirely run by volunteers, including Becky Fullen. She's been with the store since the beginning.
It's terrible that there would be a whole huge area, a whole borough. There's no bookstores or very few bookstores. So I think it's a clear demonstration of how both books and the arts and human expression are devalued.
Even if the Lit Bar creates a great atmosphere to attract customers, one challenge it faces is the Bronx is the poorest borough in New York City. Census data shows that nearly 30% of people in the Bronx were below the poverty level in 2013. And Flickr says on top of that, the population in the Bronx is very spread out.
There aren't a lot of specific places in the Bronx that have that strong a population concentration would be big enough to make a bookstore profitable.
Fullen said Word Up wasn't sure it could survive at the beginning either. The store started out just as a one-month pop-up shop, but the neighborhood has supported Word Up in its sales and fundraising campaigns on Indiegogo.
People have come in and been like, yes, I wanted a bookstore for decades. I wanted a bookstore all this time, and you don't necessarily know until it's here.
Grinchpin said even though she usually goes to the library, she plans to check out the Lit Bar when it opens. A fellow Bronx resident, Yasmin Garcia, said she's been relying on the bookstore at Hunter College, where she's a student. I asked her if she plans on visiting.
Definitely. I'm a book reader myself, so I like teen romance, I like horror, thriller.
Bronx native and owner of the Lit Bar, Noel Santos, signed a lease for the store in Mott Haven in early November. Santos didn't respond to requests for an interview, but she said on her website she hopes to open by the end of January. The next step is get a liquor license. Sheila Dane, Columbia Radio News.
The Department of Consumer Affairs is ramping up investigations and handing out fines to crisis pregnancy centers.
Those are pro-life facilities that often look and sound like doctors' offices, but they're not. Some have no medical staff, and they can provide women with faulty medical information.
As Stevie Hertz reports, regulating them is harder than it sounds.
149th Street is like many in the Bronx. There's a couple nail salons, and Dunkin' Donuts on the corner, and a CVS. But there's also a Planned Parenthood, and directly across from it, a pregnancy center, Expectant Mother Care. But unlike Planned Parenthood, it has an agenda. It wants to stop women having abortions. Carolina Fernandez is the director there.
Then we have our nurses station, and then we have our sonograms over there. So usually in the nurses station, we screen for chlamydia.
Despite all those tests and pieces of equipment, it's not actually a medical facility. Instead, Expectant Mother Care offers what it calls counselling for pregnant women. It can include false and misleading information. A city law implemented last year tries to make sure pregnant women know that these facilities aren't actually medical clinics. And now, Expectant Mother Care has become one of the first organisations to be fined. Chris Slattery founded it 33 years ago. He estimates that since then, it's persuaded 43,000 women to give birth. He suggests we speak at a restaurant on the Upper West Side.
If you're planning on an abortion or thinking about it seriously, we would discuss what those abortion methods are and how they would affect you, potentially. Anything from damage to your reproductive system, to emotional stress, to an increased risk of breast cancer.
The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists has concluded that there are no known links between having an abortion and an increased chance of breast cancer. And it's this kind of misinformation that activists say is the problem, especially when it comes from somewhere that looks like a doctor's office.
Really, the disturbing thing is that they are dealing with a population that is in an emergency situation.
Emily Kadar campaigns against pregnancy crisis centers with the National Institute for Reproductive Health.
They're in a vulnerable situation. They're looking for help. They may not know what they want to do, and they're just getting lies.
But the law is tricky. You don't actually have to be a medical professional to give an ultrasound. And the First Amendment means you can't stop people saying whatever they want. So, the law just tries to make clear that crisis centres are not medical facilities by making them say whether or not they have a doctor or nurse on site. But although it came into force last year, fines only started being given out a few months ago.
My and this organization's frustration is that this law is not currently being enforced as it needs to be. It's just not happening.
The Department of Consumer Affairs is in charge of enforcing the new law. Its spokesperson didn't want to be interviewed, but Michael Tiger, its Deputy General Counsel, testified in front of a city committee last month. He defended the time it took for enforcement to begin.
Well, there was a ramping up process, and we can see that there was a lag between the effective date and when we really have been out there doing multiple inspections.
The Department of Consumer Affairs is now increasing inspections and giving out fines. But even so, those fines can be contested. And Slattery's facility, Expectant Mother Care, isn't going down without a fight. Stevie Hertz, Columbia Radio News.
It's awards season. As we get closer to March and the Oscars, independent films are racking up awards and nominations.
Lady Bird and Call Me By Your Name have already nabbed nearly 100 between them. As Bo Hamby finds, indie winners are becoming a norm in the film industry.
What I'd really like is to be on Math Olympiad.
But math isn't something you're terribly strong in.
That we know of yet.
That's Saoirse Ronan in the independent film Lady Bird, a coming-of-age dramatic comedy that's already collected 13 trophies this season. But Lady Bird is just one of several indie films that have taken over award shows. At a Union Square theater, Aline Saruhashi was buying tickets for Call Me By Your Name, another one of the indie films that's been an awards magnet. Saruhashi thinks she knows why.
They're not trying to be a Hollywood movie. They're trying to tell us another thing that Hollywood movies are not.
And for indie movies, recognition at an award show is a big deal, especially the Academy Awards, where taking home a golden trophy can be the difference between failure and success.
The Oscars and other awards shows remain very important and remain particularly important to independent filmmakers because every award that they win brings more attention to their film.
That's Claudia Calhoun, a visiting assistant professor of cinema studies at the NYU Tisch School of the Arts. She says awards bring attention, and they also bring prestige, like Moonlight, winner of Best Picture at last year's Oscars.
I can't say the numbers for Moonlight and what happens after it won the Oscar, but for the rest of the life of that picture, it'll be able to say on its cover as part of its marketing, Best Picture winner of 2000 and whatever. And that's something that other movies cannot say.
But indie films haven't always dominated award shows. Milton Tabbitt, the senior director of programming at the Independent Filmmaker Project, says indies first started getting awards attention back in the 90s.
I think that's been a kind of ongoing process, very gradual since the 90s through the aughts to now, just in terms of it seemed like every few years there was maybe one indie that would pop and would get an Oscar nomination.
Over that time, studios just became less focused on awards. Eric Cohn, a film critic for the website IndieWire, says studios turned their attention towards movies with a broader appeal.
Studios, by and large, don't make movies anymore that would necessarily appeal to the award season sensibility.
Cohn says studios are now more concentrated on making movies like Wonder Woman or Beauty and the Beast, two movies that totaled around $500 million each at the box office. And that kind of financial success is achieved without awards recognition, something studios have no problem letting go of.
It is incredibly costly to mount an award season campaign, and while it might generate a lot of prestige value, it doesn't necessarily yield commercial success.
And so blockbusters are no longer taking up as many seats at the award show table, which leaves room for indie films, who are eager to fill the gap. But Cohn says money isn't the only reason indies are dominating. The Academy Awards and other shows are recognizing more films that speak to greater cultural movements, like gender or racial diversity in Hollywood. Acknowledging those films is a way of celebrating progress.
You're starting to see those movies gain more traction as sort of a response to the deficiencies of the past, and the Oscars are one way of sort of acknowledging progress. So it's much more exciting now to acknowledge that progress by, giving these awards to movies that we haven't seen before.
like Call Me By Your Name, about two men falling in love, or Get Out, a film that Cohn sees as a response to racial tensions in America. Those two indies, and Lady Bird, all received Best Motion Picture nominations from the Golden Globes on Monday, setting them up for what could be a long and successful award season. Bo Hamby, Columbia Radio News.
That does it for this edition of Uptown Radio. We hope you enjoyed the show.
Our foreman today was executive producer Lisette Arevalo. Leading our staff of reporters was senior producer Juliette Jabkiro.
Director Bo Hamby coordinated our studio production with Sheila Dang and Greg Gottfried, who also streamed this to the web.
Bo Hamby produced the news. Senior editor Stevie Hertz led our copy team.
Our instructors Carrie Donahue, Sally Herships, and Isabella Kulkarni advised our staff. I'm Aaron Leibowitz.
And a big shout out to Carrie Donahue on her last broadcast from the Columbia Journalism School. I'm Cassiana McClenahan. Until next time, you can always find us on uptownradio.org. From all of us here at Uptown Radio, thanks for listening.